To give you some context, my mother-in-law is the type of person who loves to exaggerate even the smallest accomplishments, turning them into grand spectacles. Despite lacking refinement in her own life, she insists on presenting herself as the center of attention in our social circles. One of the most absurd examples of this behavior is her so-called monthly club party. In reality, there is no club, it's just a gathering of her friends and coworkers, whom she refers to as her fellow I-Geeks, due to their shared profession. This ritual has been going on for years, with each meeting dedicated to bragging about their latest achievements. Given her flair for dramatics, it was no surprise that she was eager to boast about my upcoming destination wedding, something my grandfather had generously gifted me after hearing me talk about my dream wedding for years. It included a 6-day stay for our guests, and since our budget and venue capacity were limited, my fiancé and I had carefully curated a guest list. After much deliberation, I invited 22 close family members, while my fiancé selected 18 of his own. Just as we were finalizing the invitations, my mother-in-law showed up at our home unannounced at 9 p.m., no less. From the moment she stepped in, I knew she was about to cause trouble. She demanded changes to the guest list, acting as though she had a right to dictate who should attend my own wedding. To my shock, my fiancé backed her up. When I asked what changes she wanted, she casually mentioned that she had already promised invitations to a few of her work friends, members of her so-called I-Geeks group. I politely explained that our list was already full, consisting only of people we were genuinely close to, but instead of understanding, she insisted I make adjustments. Seeking support from my fiancé, I was met with disappointment. He refused to look me in the eye and continued to side with her. Growing increasingly frustrated, I showed her the guest list and emphasized that every person on it had a meaningful place in our lives. Unbothered, she suggested removing my cousin, who had been like a sister to me and whom I had lived with for 5 years after college. Her reasoning? My cousin had recently moved to Birmingham, and traveling to the States would be inconvenient. That was the final straw. I turned to my fiancé, hoping he would finally put his foot down, but he only reinforced his mother's stance, arguing that since she had already told her colleagues about the wedding, it would be embarrassing not to invite them. I was livid. Instead of arguing further, I left the room, unwilling to waste another moment trying to reason with two people who clearly had no regard for my wishes. By the next morning, I had made up my mind. I would beat them at their own game. If they wanted to treat my wedding like a networking event, I could be just as ruthless in proving a point. I called my grandfather and explained everything that had happened. Then, I did something drastic. I told him I was taking him, my grandmother, and my uncle's family off the guest list, and, since he was no longer invited, I asked him to rescind his wedding gift, the very thing that had made the destination wedding possible. To my relief, my grandfather understood my reasoning and supported me without hesitation. When I sent the revised guest list to my mother-in-law and fiancé, their shock was palpable. Calmly, I explained that those were the only guests I could remove. Unfortunately, they happened to be the ones funding half of our wedding. Without my grandfather's contribution, we had lost our venue. That meant my fiancé now had two choices: find a new venue in 2 months or postpone the wedding entirely. On top of that, they would have to reprint invitations and rearrange accommodations for our guests. I wanted them to fully grasp that none of this chaos would have happened if they hadn't tried to manipulate a gift from my family to serve their social agenda. But even as the consequences of their actions became clear, I didn't expect them to suddenly apologize. My mother-in-law showed up again, this time filled with remorse. She admitted that pressuring me to change the guest list was a mistake and begged me to call my grandfather, asking him to reinstate the hotel reservations and undo the changes. I couldn't help but question her sudden change of heart. Why now? She had already gotten what she wanted. Her colleagues had secured their invitations, but now that reality had set in, she realized the grand destination wedding was slipping away. She lamented that a regular, local wedding would be dull and unimpressive, making it clear that appearances mattered more to her than anything else. At that moment, my husband finally acknowledged his mistake. He admitted he regretted taking her side, but I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. I reminded him that supporting me in such an obvious situation shouldn't require drastic consequences. Though he apologized again, I made it clear, my decision was final. Even if I re-invited my grandfather, his incredibly generous gift was gone for good. Was I being unreasonable for standing my ground? Maybe, but this was my wedding, and I had every right to put myself first. Still, A small part of me wondered if I was being petty for not undoing my decision. Did that make me a bad person? But my mother-in-law wasn't done stirring the pot. As I expected, she was furious that I refused to ask my grandfather to reinstate his gift. She began calling my fiancé every other day, painting me as an ungrateful troublemaker out for revenge. Did I enjoy knowing my decision had consequences for her? Yes, a little. But hearing her label me as the problem, when she was the one who created this mess, was infuriating. Then she crossed a new line. She started telling my fiancé to reconsider his life choices. She hinted that my actions were just the beginning and that if he married me, this kind of conflict would become his new reality. One evening, I overheard one of these conversations because my fiancé had her on speakerphone. I was actually grateful for the transparency. Normally, he tried to shield me from anything that could cause tension between us. To his credit, he did tell her she was out of line, but he didn't confront her as firmly as I wished he would. I understand that his relationship with his mother is his own, and I would never ask him to cut ties. But I also know that if she continues meddling in our lives, there will come a breaking point. I refuse to spend my life battling for my husband's loyalty. Today, I had a heartfelt conversation with my grandfather, sharing the news that we had secured a new wedding venue. It wasn't the dream setting I had envisioned, but it was beautiful, and I had made peace with it. I told him he was invited once again, and his warm laughter reassured me. My love and gratitude for him were overwhelming. Through it all, he had been my unwavering support. It was time to confront my husband about his mother's ongoing interference. Our conversation was difficult, forcing us to acknowledge the damage that had already been done. In the end, he promised to set firm boundaries with her and define her place in our life. I could only hope that moving forward, we'd finally have some peace. Then, at last, the wedding day arrived. I am officially married. Despite all the chaos, the day was perfect, and I felt nothing but happiness. I couldn't help but smirk when I spotted my mother-in-law sulking in a corner, surrounded by the very colleagues she had fought so hard to invite. And then, the ultimate twist. My grandfather surprised us with a house as a wedding gift, a gesture made possible by him and my uncles. In the end, I feel nothing but joy as I embark on this new chapter with my husband. To everyone who has followed this journey, thank you. It infuriates me when people think they have the right to dictate someone else's wedding, let alone who should be invited. My mother-in-law needed a reminder that her time of control is over. If she wants an event to show off at, she can plan one herself. And as for my husband, I do love him, but I won't ignore the lessons this experience has taught me. Some battles are worth fighting, and some people, no matter how close, should never have been given the power to interfere in the first place. I live in Queensland, while my family resides in New South Wales. Recently, after their cruise was cancelled, my parents and my 27-year-old sister decided to invite themselves to my house for a week-long stay. To be honest, I wasn't thrilled about the arrangement. I'm pregnant, already juggling the demands of a 2-year-old, and my home isn't exactly spacious. I have only one spare queen-sized bed, which my parents took, leaving my sister to sleep on the couch. She could have shared my bed since my husband was away for work, but her snoring made that impossible. 2 days into their stay, during dinner, my dad casually dropped a bombshell. Without consulting me, they had invited my sister's boyfriend, whom she had been dating for just 5 weeks, to fly up and stay for the entire weekend. He had already booked his flight and would be arriving Friday morning at 9 a.m. I had never met this man before. He had barely been in my sister's life, and now he was expected to stay in my home? The sheer entitlement of it floored me. There was no space for him to sleep comfortably, and more importantly, the idea of a complete stranger in my house while my young child slept in the next room made me deeply uncomfortable. Frustrated, I called my husband, and together we decided to put our foot down. We refused, making it clear that inviting an unfamiliar person into our home, without even asking, was unacceptable. When I called my sister to communicate our decision, my mother exploded in rage. She accused me of doubting their judgment, insisting they wouldn't invite someone untrustworthy, despite only having met him a handful of times. Then, instead of respecting my boundaries, they hung up on me, hastily packed their belongings, and stormed out of my house. Later, I received a text blaming my husband for manipulating me against them. According to them, they weren't leaving because they were wrong but because I had been an inhospitable host. They even went so far as to claim I had become a terrible person since marrying my husband 10 years ago. 3 days passed before they called me again, acting as if nothing had happened. Their inability to comprehend why I had reacted the way I did left me completely baffled. Am I overreacting? I don't think so. I was simply being a responsible parent, not an unreasonable one. I never invited them in the first place, they invited themselves. I accommodated them despite the disruption it caused to my life. But bringing an additional person into my home, without my consent, crossed a line. And their tantrum when I refused to cave, that only reinforced how entitled they had become. This was a wake-up call. Boundaries need to be set. In my response, I made it clear. I wasn't a terrible host. Because I wasn't a host at all, they imposed themselves on me. Moving forward, there will be strict conditions before I ever consider allowing them to stay again. For now, I have no intention of going out of my way to spend time with them after the childish behavior they displayed. I'm done with their entitlement. Until I feel ready to engage with them again, I'm limiting contact. They crossed a major boundary by inviting someone I had never met into my home without even asking. The fact that they only told me at the last minute proves they knew I wouldn't approve. They just assumed I'd be too much of a pushover to stop them. But they were wrong. I'm standing up for myself, my home, and the safety of my children, and I have no doubt that I made the right call.